The knock on my hotel room door came at 11 at night, and when I opened it, the last person I expected to see was standing there with her suitcase and her eyes full of panic. My ex-girlfriend's younger sister, asking me to be her fake fiancé for the biggest wedding of her family's year. If you believe in second chances, in the strange ways life brings people back together, and in stories that remind you love doesn't always follow the rules you expect, stay with me, and if this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel, because it truly helps stories like this reach more hearts. My name is Arjun, and 3 years ago my heart had been broken by a woman named Meher, someone I thought I would marry, someone whose family had once felt like my own. When we ended things, it wasn't loud or ugly, it was just quiet and sad. The kind of ending that leaves a bruise you don't notice until you press on it years later. I moved cities after that, took a job in Pune, buried myself in work, and told myself I was fine. I wasn't lying exactly, I had just gotten good at not looking too closely at the parts of myself that still ached. I hadn't spoken to Meher's family in years, which is why it felt like the universe playing a cruel joke when her younger sister Ritika showed up outside my hotel room door in the same resort where her cousin's wedding was being held. The same weekend I happened to be staying there for a work conference. Ritika and I had always gotten along. She used to tease me for being too serious, and back when I dated her sister she treated me like the older brother she never had. Seeing her again after all this time, grown up, stressed, and clutching her phone like a lifeline, hit me somewhere unexpected. She explained everything in a rush, the words tumbling out before I could even invite her in properly. Her family had been pressuring her for 2 years about marriage, comparing her to cousins who were already settled, hinting at rishtas she didn't want, and worst of all, an aunt who had spent the last 6 months insisting Ritika was hiding something, that she was probably seeing someone unsuitable, someone the family wouldn't approve of. To stop the interrogations at the wedding, Ritika had panicked and told her mother she was engaged to a man who worked abroad and couldn't make it to India often. The lie had spiraled the way lies do, and now, at the wedding itself, relatives were asking to see him, to meet the man who had apparently swept her off her feet. And then, by coincidence, or maybe not coincidence at all, she had spotted me in the hotel lobby that afternoon while checking in with her parents. She said the moment she saw my face across that marble floor, an idea formed that felt both insane and like the only way out. She knew I understood her family, knew their language, their humor, their questions better than any stranger she could rope in. She asked me, standing in that doorway with her voice shaking, if I would pretend, just for the weekend, to be the fiancé she'd invented. I should have said no immediately. Every reasonable part of me knew that walking back into that family, even in disguise, even for 2 days, was walking straight into old wounds I had spent 3 years trying to heal. But there was something in her eyes, something desperate and young and scared, that reminded me of every time I had needed someone to catch me and nobody had. So instead of refusing, I asked her one question: does Meher know you're doing this? Ritika went pale, and admitted that Meher didn't even know I was the one she'd asked, that Meher had actually flown in for the wedding too, and was staying 2 floors above us in this very hotel. That should have been my answer right there, the reason to close the door and go back to my quiet, uncomplicated life. But Ritika started crying, actual tears, telling me that if this fell apart tonight, her mother would humiliate her in front of 300 guests tomorrow, and that she had nobody else to call. There's a particular kind of guilt that comes from watching someone younger than you break down over something you have the power to fix, and I felt it settle into my chest like a stone. I told her to come in, and we spent the next hour building a story: how we met, how long we'd been together, why I traveled so much for work, what I would say if her father asked about my intentions. By midnight I had somehow agreed to spend the weekend as a stranger's fiancé in the one place on earth where I least wanted to be seen. The next morning, I stood in the hotel banquet hall wearing a borrowed sherwani Ritika's cousin had lent me, surrounded by decorations in gold and red, the air thick with the smell of marigolds and fried snacks, and I felt like a man walking into his own execution. Ritika introduced me to her mother first, a formidable woman named Sunita Auntie who studied my face for a long 10 seconds before breaking into a smile and pulling me into a hug that smelled like sandalwood perfume. She told me she'd always known Ritika had good taste, and my stomach twisted with guilt so sharp it nearly doubled me over. I smiled anyway, because Ritika was standing behind her mother with her palms pressed together in silent, desperate gratitude, and I couldn't let her down now. The lie held for exactly 4 hours. Through the mehendi ceremony, through polite conversations with uncles who asked what I did for a living, through a cousin's wife who wanted wedding date suggestions, until Meher walked into the hall wearing a deep green sari, laughing at something her cousin said, and stopped completely still when she saw me standing beside her sister with a garland of flowers around my neck. The silence between us stretched so long that people around us noticed, conversations dying mid-sentence as everyone realized something was wrong. Meher's eyes moved from my face to Ritika's, and I watched 3 years of careful composure crumble in front of an entire wedding hall. She didn't scream or make a scene, which somehow made it worse. She just asked, very quietly, what exactly was happening, and why her ex-boyfriend was standing at her cousin's wedding, pretending to be engaged to her little sister. Ritika grabbed her hand and pulled her into a side room before the situation could explode further, and I followed because there was nowhere else to go. And because some instinct told me this conversation needed to happen with all 3 of us in the room. Ritika confessed everything in a flood of words and apologies, how the lie had started small and grown into something she couldn't control, how she'd panicked yesterday and asked me because she trusted me even after everything, how she never meant to hurt anyone. Meher listened with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, and when Ritika finished, the room fell into a silence heavier than anything I'd experienced since our breakup. Meher finally spoke, and her voice wasn't angry the way I expected. It was tired, the way voices get when someone has been carrying something too long. She said she understood the pressure Ritika was under better than anyone, because their mother had done the same thing to her for years before she gave up trying to please everyone, and just focused on her own life. Then she turned to me and asked why I had agreed. Why, out of everyone, I had said yes to something this reckless. I told her the truth. That Ritika reminded me of someone who needed help the way I once did, and that I couldn't walk away from that, even knowing the risk of running into her. Something shifted in Meher's expression when I said that, something I couldn't quite name, softening at the edges like ice starting to crack under warm water. She asked to speak with me alone, and Ritika slipped out gratefully, leaving the 2 of us standing in a room full of leftover wedding decorations, string lights, and unspoken history. We talked for almost an hour, the kind of conversation that should have happened 3 years earlier but never did because both of us had been too proud or too hurt to start it. She told me she'd always wondered if she made the right choice ending things, that she'd built walls after our breakup the same way I had, throwing herself into her career, avoiding anything that felt like real vulnerability. I told her about the year I couldn't listen to certain songs without leaving the room, about how I still sometimes reached for my phone to text her before remembering I couldn't. Neither of us apologized exactly, because there was nothing dramatic to apologize for, just 2 people who had loved each other and lost the thread of how to keep doing it. By the time we walked out of that room, something between us had changed, not fixed, not resolved, but softened, the way old scar tissue becomes less tender with time and attention. We agreed to actually get through the wedding as ourselves, no more pretending, and to let Ritika's mother know the truth in whatever way caused the least damage. Ritika was terrified when we told her our plan, certain her mother would explode. But Meher took charge in a way I hadn't seen from her before, walking up to Sunita auntie that evening and explaining, calmly and firmly, that Ritika had panicked under family pressure and made up a story, and that everyone needed to stop treating marriage like a countdown timer on a woman's worth. I expected shouting. Instead, Sunita auntie went quiet for a long moment, looked at her younger daughter's frightened face, and then did something none of us anticipated. She started laughing, not cruelly, but with the exhausted relief of someone realizing they'd been fighting the wrong battle. She admitted she'd pressured Ritika because she was scared of being judged by relatives, scared her daughter would end up lonely, scared in the particular way mothers get scared when they mistake control for love. She actually apologized to Ritika in front of the family, which took more courage than anyone in that hall probably understood. The rest of the wedding weekend unfolded differently than any of us expected. Ritika finally admitted quietly to her sister and me the next morning over breakfast that there actually was someone she'd been seeing, a colleague from her office that she'd been too afraid to mention because he came from a different community and she assumed her family would never approve. Meher, surprising all of us again, offered to help her navigate that conversation with their parents when the time came, promising Ritika she wouldn't have to fight that battle alone, the way Meher once felt she had to fight her own battles alone. As for Meher and me, we didn't rush back into anything, because some bridges need to be rebuilt slowly, plank by plank, not sprinted across. But we exchanged numbers again that weekend, properly this time. Not out of nostalgia but out of a genuine curiosity about who we'd both become. We talked on the phone twice that week after the wedding ended. Careful conversations that felt like relearning a language we used to speak fluently. She told me about a promotion she was up for. I told her about a project I'd been dreading. And somewhere in those ordinary details, something that had been dormant for 3 years began, very cautiously, to wake up again. I won't pretend this story ends with a proposal or a fairy tale reunion tied up in a neat bow, because real healing doesn't work that way, and I think stories are more honest and more powerful when they admit that. What I can tell you is that 6 months after that wedding, Meher and I started seeing each other again, slowly, deliberately choosing each other this time with the wisdom that only comes from having lost something once and learning what it actually costs. Ritika, for her part, gathered the courage to introduce her boyfriend to her parents last spring, and though it wasn't an easy conversation, her mother, remembering the lesson she'd learned at that wedding, listened instead of lectured. What stays with me most, when I think back on that strange, chaotic weekend, is how one small act of kindness, agreeing to help a scared young woman for a few hours, unraveled into something that repaired far more than either of us expected. I think about how easy it would have been to say no, to protect myself, to avoid the discomfort of walking back into a room full of people who once nearly became my family. But sometimes the very things we're most afraid to face are the ones holding the door open to healing we didn't know we needed. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that second chances are real, and that kindness has a way of circling back to us when we least expect it, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to this channel for more stories just like this one. And before you go, I'd love to know, wherever you're watching this from, which country are you in right now? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I always love seeing how far these stories travel, and how many hearts they reach across the world.